In this lecture, we will learn about job design and job crafting. First, we'll start with an overview of what job design and job crafting are and how they're distinguishable from job analysis. And then we'll do deeper dives into job design, followed by job crafting, and at the end, I'll introduce a related concept called workability. So let's start with the overview. So job analysis can be distinguished from job design and job crafting. And so how is that? Well, if you recall, a job analysis is as follows. A job analysis focuses on determining what work is being performed for a given job and the worker characteristics needed to perform the work successfully. However, that does not necessarily mean that the identified work and the application of KSAOs for that particular job will lead to a desirable worker experience in terms of performance and well-being. So it's important to note here that, again, with job analysis, our focus is on determining what work is being performed for a given job, and that includes tasks, duties, and responsibilities, as well as those worker characteristics, such as those KSAOs, those knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics. However, just because we know what work is required for a given job and what worker characteristics help perform that job in order for that work to be done successfully, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the identified work and the application of those KSAOs are going to lead to a desirable experience for the worker. And so that's where job design and job crafting come into play. So in contrast, job design and job crafting both have to do with how workers experience and react to their work and how the work affects their performance and well-being. So let's now take that deeper dive into job design. Now, job design goes by different names. Often it's referred to job design, but commonly today you'll also hear it referred to as work design, as that's a little bit more broad in terms of not just being limited to a specific job, but any type of work that someone performs in an organization. So what is job design? Well, to quote Bauer, Erdwin, Coughlin, Bauer from 2020, job design is the process of identifying how a job's characteristics are experienced from the employee's perspective to enhance well-being and performance. Now, it's often considered when creating a new job, and this is called job design, but it can also be considered when changing an existing job, and this is where job redesign comes into play. And now, why might we redesign a job? We might do so for the purposes of enhancing worker well-being and performance, and when we design a job in the first place that hasn't yet existed within our organization, we should not only consider what will be important in terms of the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics and the tasks, duties, and responsibilities required for that job, but also take into consideration how the person is going to experience the work that they're performing for that job. And in terms of experience, again, we want to focus on both their well-being and their performance. Now, job design also focuses on workers' perceptions and experiences of their work and their reactions to their work, which can, for example, take the form of psychological and physical strain, perceptions of monotony, and perceptions of meaningfulness. Now, it's important to note that job design is something that's performed by the organization. When we get to job crafting, we'll learn how job crafting is actually something that's done and performed by the individual worker themselves. So let's now talk about some common approaches to job design within an organization. We'll talk specifically about the mechanistic approach, the motivational approach, the biological approach, and the perceptual motor approach. I will note right at the top here, though, that the motivational approach and the mechanistic approaches tend to be more within the jurisdiction of typically what human resource professionals would be most qualified for and experienced with actually providing guidance on and support with. The biological and perceptual motor approaches that you'll learn about, as you'll be able to see, these require additional specializations or other specializations in order to be able to perform these successfully in many cases. Okay, so let's start with the mechanistic approach. This is one of the oldest approaches to job design. So what's important to remember with the mechanistic approach, that our goal is to increase efficiency in terms of how the work is being performed. The goal isn't on worker experience with this approach necessarily, it's on the worker and the work and how it's being performed. Now, this is often in the mechanistic approach going to entail reducing the complexity of work to provide more human resource efficiency, which means that we're trying to make things, break them down into simpler steps. So if there's a task someone needs to complete, let's say that they're assembling a particular product as part of their goal within the organization, We might break that down into simpler steps so one person is only assembling the same part of that product each time it comes to them, or that it's passed forward by another worker, and then they pass it along to someone else who does another repetitive task and does this over and over again. This improves efficiency, but as you can imagine, this also creates monotony too, because people aren't applying very much skill variety. They're doing the same type of skill application and the same type of smaller, narrower task over and over again. So where did the mechanistic approach come from? Well, it's actually rooted in classical industrial engineering and scientific scientific management, that is. And scientific management really was pioneered by someone called Frederick Taylor in the early parts of the 1900s. Now, as I was alluding to before, the mechanistic approach is well designed for increasing efficiency in terms of how work is being performed, but in terms of the worker's experience and their well-being, it could actually reduce the complexity of a job to a fault. And what I mean by that is that it could result in boredom or monotony and a lack of motivation and meaningfulness in the work itself. So let's shift gears now and talk about the motivational approach to job design. And this is an approach to job design that should be within the comfort zone of most HR professionals. So with the motivational approach, our goal is to increase the motivation to perform the work itself. And we're also focused on the worker's experience as they perform this work. And so this often entails increasing the perception of meaningfulness of the work, the perception of responsibility that one gets from performing the work, and the perception of the knowledge of performance or the feedback one receives on that particular job or the work that they're doing for that job. Now, the motivational approach is typically associated with increases in intrinsic motivation, job satisfaction, and performance, as well as decreases in outcomes like absenteeism and turnover. Now, the motivational job design approach often is carried out by human resource professionals, as I noted. So because of that, we're going to take a little bit, even a more deep dive into the motivational approach and learn an important framework that we can apply in this context to make jobs more intrinsically motivating. Now, this framework is called the job characteristics model, and it was developed as a way of understanding the motivating potential of the job itself in relation to the individual. And the job characteristics model was really pioneered and developed by Hackman and Oldham in the 1970s. Now, it's been found to be a useful, an effective, and evidence-informed approach for increasing employee motivation and other work outcomes such as job satisfaction and job performance. So let's take a closer look at the job characteristics model. Well, the job characteristics model is, as the name implies, predicated on job characteristics. So what are these job characteristics? Well, the model specifies that there's 5 different job characteristics that we should consider. This is not an exhaustive list, but within the confines of this model, these are 5 important characteristics of a job we should consider. And these are skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback. And so the idea is that when people perceive high levels of these 5 job characteristics, which are often called the core job characteristics, this leads to the key psychological states of perceptions of meaningfulness of the work, responsibility of the work, and knowledge of results related to one's work. Now, ultimately, it's through this intermediary mechanism of key psychological states that job characteristics ultimately lead to outcomes on the job and for the organization. And so, as I mentioned before, outcomes could include increased motivation, performance, job satisfaction, as well as decrements or decreases in absenteeism and turnover. So let's define these 5 job characteristics in a little bit more detail. So what do we mean by skill variety? Well, this one's fairly intuitive. This means it's a person's perception, and it's important that all of these have to do with perception. And so we have to think about that when we're trying to design a job, think about how people are actually going to perceive the job in terms of these 5 characteristics. So skill variety is the perception of one's opportunity to apply an assortment of skills on a particular job. Task identity has to do with one's perception of completing an entire or a complete piece of work on the job. Okay, so how well do you understand what you're doing in terms of your tasks, duties, and responsibilities is contributing to an entire piece of work? Now, if you're working in a manufacturing setting, this might be fairly clear. If you're helping to put together an automobile or a car in an assembly plant, you might have a pretty good idea how you are completing part of that or a complete piece of that car. Whether it's the putting together the engine or the transmission, those are all things that people could perceive as being incomplete pieces, or it could be completing the entire car itself. And this is what some assembly plants will do. They'll actually do team-based assembly where an entire team from start to finish will assemble the entire car. Now, task significance differs because it is a person's perception of, in terms of how the work being performed is perceived as important and worthwhile. So in other words, you can think of task significance as being, does a person perceive that their work is actually influencing the work, the health, and the well-being of other people? And those people could be coworkers or colleagues. They could be their supervisor. It could be their subordinates. It can also be people outside of the organization. It could be customers or clients, or if you're in a healthcare setting, it could be patients and patients' family members, or it could be the broader community. Are you doing work, for example, that is going to lead to more sustainable environmental practices that can help the world and can help the ecosystem around where you live? So again, these are three important job characteristics here: skill variety, task identity, and task significance. And we'll talk about in a second how these lead to the key state, psychological state of perceived meaningfulness of work. Now, the next job characteristic is autonomy, and this has to do with a person's perception that they have the freedom and control to perform the work how they'd like to do it. That doesn't mean they get to decide necessarily what work they're doing, but they get to think about how they're completing the tasks, duties, and responsibilities that are assigned to them. Now, the last of the 5 job characteristics in this model is feedback. And feedback is the perception of the degree to which feedback about performance is provided on the job. In other words, to what extent are you getting knowledge about the results, and do you perceive that you're getting that information? Because that's important too. Just because someone else gives a person feedback doesn't necessarily mean that that other person recognizes it as feedback or that they are going to accept it as feedback. So as I mentioned, these 5 job characteristics of skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback lead to the key psychological states of meaningfulness, responsibility, and knowledge of results. As I mentioned briefly, skill variety, task identity, and task significance are theorized to lead to perceptions of meaningfulness of one's work. So when people perceive higher levels of those 3 job characteristics, they're more likely to experience perceived meaningfulness of the work. Now, autonomy, on the other hand, this is going to lead to the key psychological state of perceptions of responsibility about the work. And this follows because when you think about autonomy being a person's freedom or discretion to complete work how they'd like to complete it, well, if you have that freedom or discretion to determine how you're going to complete work, this will actually increase your sense of responsibility. And then finally, with feedback, this one's more intuitive, and this will lead to the key psychological state of knowledge of results. If you get feedback about how you're performing, it follows that it will lead to higher knowledge of the results or more knowledge of results. Now, let's take a look at the third type of a common approach to job design that we'll focus on here, which is the biological approach. So what is the biological approach? Well, the goal of the biological approach is to reduce worker physical strain by structuring the physical work environment around the way the human body moves and how the body works. So this is going to focus on the physical demands of the work and the principles of biomechanics. Now, the biological approach to job design is going to be most commonly performed by an ergonomist or someone that's trained in ergonomics. And these are people who specialize in the interface between an individual's physiological characteristics and the physical environment in which they find themselves. So ergonomists can work within organizational settings They can also work in homes and so forth. And maybe some of you have actually gotten guidance from an ergonomist or at least checked out a website. I believe many universities typically have some resources in terms of how to set up your desk, how to set up your monitor, your keyboard, and so forth to reduce physical strain. And so your monitor, your desk, the lamp, the lighting, anything that you're working with in that physical environment, that is your physical environment. And so we are concerned with the biological approach, how you actually interface or interact with that physical environment in terms of your physical, your muscles, your musculature, your skeletal system, all of these systems that comprise the body, how these are going to interact with that environment. So let's finish up by talking about the perceptual motor approach, which is the fourth common approach to job design. So with the perceptual motor approach, our goal is to ensure that the work itself does not exceed workers' mental capabilities and limitations. And so this is often focused on reducing cognitive fatigue and errors and on enhancing positive user reactions and experiences to the work environment itself. Now, the perceptual motor approach to job design is often performed by those who specialize in what is called human factors. And so human factors people are often the people that are going to help design things like an aircraft's cockpit. So where the pilots sit, and as you can see pictured here, there's a number of dials and instruments and so forth that they have to be aware of. And they want to figure out how can they design this so that all of the information they need, all of the different types of decisions they would need to make, buttons they need to push and so forth, can be done effectively and not exceed those pilots' mental capabilities and limitations and not result in undue cognitive fatigue or too much cognitive fatigue. And as you can imagine with pilots who are piloting an aircraft of some kind, especially commercial aircraft with passengers, we don't want them to commit any types of errors either because those could actually be deadly in the case of a pilot. And so human factors professionals will try to design these cockpits to put buttons and dials and so forth that are commonly used or that are really important closer to the eye line of where someone's going to look regularly so that they'll be sure to see those things. So you can distinguish the perceptual motor approach from the biological approach because the biological approach looks at that interface between the physical body and the physical environment. You can think of the perceptual motor approach focusing on that interface between the worker's cognitive system, their brain, and also the rest of their nervous system, and how that is going to react and interface with the mental demands and requirements of a job. So let's shift gears now and do our deep dive into job crafting, which is similar but distinguishable from job design. So what is job crafting? Well, job crafting is redesigning one's own job to fit one's needs. And so what do I mean by needs here? Well, we mean that needs are the abilities, interest, and personality and other things like that. So we're talking about essentially job design, but doing it for yourself. If you are the worker, you're redesigning your own job or changing your perceptions of how you think about your existing job in order to fit your own needs. So this can be thought of as a skill that can be trained or developed, which is important. And for that reason, some organizations will actually provide training on job crafting. And this is one way of signaling it's okay to craft your job and maybe putting boundaries on what can be crafted, but also teaching people how to do it effectively. Now, for job crafting to work, organizations must provide workers with sufficient autonomy. And remember, autonomy is that one of those key job characteristics, core job characteristics that has to do with a person's perception of the freedom and decision latitude they have to perform the work. So that decision or being able to perform the work how you want to perform it. So we need to make sure there's sufficient autonomy in place so that people can actually engage in job crafting in the first place. Now, as I mentioned earlier, job crafting is also distinguishable from job design because job design is performed by the organization. It's something that the organization designs and implements to workers. Job crafting, on the other hand, is all about the worker doing this themselves. It's performed by the worker themselves. So let's finish up by talking about workability. Now, workability is a somewhat related concept or construct that I want to make sure that we bring into the conversation in this lecture. And part of that is because it's been receiving more attention in the United States recently and in North America, whereas it had originated in Europe for the most part and has received quite a bit of attention there, especially in workplaces and in medical science in the European Union and Europe more broadly. So what is workability? Well, workability refers to an individual's ability to continue working a job. So why is this important? Well, it has to do with the extent to which an individual's physical and mental abilities meet the demands of a job. So a job will require certain things of people. Maybe they have to stand for long hours. Maybe they have to sit in front of a computer for long hours, or they have to read a lot every day. Now, this is especially important to consider when people are aging, which everybody is aging. And as people get older, we want to assess and work with people around the idea of what is their ability to continue working in a particular job as it's currently structured or as it's currently designed. And so higher workability is important because it's been found in research to be associated with more positive job attitudes and more positive work behaviors. So this is a newer concept, as I mentioned, in North America and the United States specifically, but it has been around for some time in Europe. And it does make sense that we should start focusing more on workability because we do have an aging workforce here in the United States, like a number of other countries around the world. And so we want to make sure that we are thinking about ways in which we can help support people so that they can continue to meet the demands of their job. So in this lecture, we learned about what job design is, what job crafting is, and how they're distinguishable from job analysis. And then we just finished up learning about this newer concept, at least in North America and the United States, called workability. So here are the references for this particular lecture. Here are the images. And this wraps up the lecture on job design and job crafting.